Welcome to Collective Conversations. We host a diverse range of leaders to discuss themes and topics that impact our churches today. We pray this discussion becomes a catalyst for your own spiritual growth and leadership. Let's jump in. Welcome to Ministering to Nomads. We're recording a live podcast this afternoon at Collective. We're really thrilled that you are here with us. And if you are listening to or watching this podcast, welcome. We're really glad that you are tuning in as well. My name is Emily Ferguson. I'm one of the storytellers in our network. That basically means that my job is to be curious, which is one of my favourite things in life. And I was at work one day earlier this year when I heard that Sue Whiteley had a dream. Now, when you hear something like that, for me anyway, I am curious. If I hear Sue Whiteley had a dream, then I'm curious about that. And I remain curious about the contents of that dream. And we're all going to watch Sue on video tell us about this dream that she had. And then we're going to host a conversation together about some of the nuances that we face in serving those who are struggling to be part of a Sunday church gathering, but still desire to follow Jesus. So turn your eyes to the screens and we'll watch Sue talk to us about her dream.
This dream was so startling that it roused me from my sleep into consciousness. The feeling of absolute delight and amazement filled my spirit, and that's when the strength of that emotion woke me. In the dream, I was awarded a new role. I was to now become a chaplain at the Sydney airport. Immediately, I sat up and reached for my phone thinking, is there even a thing such as a chaplain at an airport? The thought had never crossed my mind. And to my surprise, yes, there was. And I looked up on my phone all the things that they do at an airport. An airport chaplain attends to people caught at the airport who are displaced, need some care while they are in transit. And then I looked up on Seek thinking, maybe there's a job going. But of course there were no jobs at the time. But the power of this dream lingered with me for weeks, and I even journaled about the strength of the main feeling of deep compatibility with this role. 3 months later, I'm attending the Churches of Christ Collective Conference, and I was chatting to some of my many chaplain buddies who were all planning to socialise at the pub the following day. And I said to them, hey, can I come along too? Because I'd love to catch up with you all. And they, playfully teasing me, said, but you aren't really a chaplain, are you? And I said, well, perhaps you need to hear about my dream. And so I told them the dream, and they too were really curious about whether there was such a thing as an airport chaplain. And then fast forward to the next morning at the conference. And we delegates are all listening to Jack Reese, a speaker from the US, speak about the current issues facing the church. And he referenced that there is currently a large number of people struggling with not being able to stay in their current church contexts. They love God and they're kingdom committed and they love the greater church, but they can no longer bear the predictable service mentality Sunday by Sunday. And then Jack made a statement that just electrified me. He said, we need to become a transit lounge. There are people coming out of the church but don't know yet where they want to go. And suddenly I felt transported back to my dream. A transit lounge, a person who cares and attends for those who are displaced, an airport chaplain. And after Jack's talk, 2 of the people who had heard my dream story the night before came and approached me separately and said, hey Sue, when Jack Reese said transit lounge, the Holy Spirit assured me that that was connected to your dream and that I must come and tell you. Now, I've had a long-held conviction that when something is truly prophetic, first the person must have their own sense it's from God, and then it's followed by two other witnesses. And the significance of those two affirming witnesses were not lost on me. And it was then that I realised this dream was not really about me, but it was about the church. Once I'd returned home from the conference, I told some close family about the dream and what I thought it meant. In telling my family, my sister piped up and said, "Hey, you should watch the movie with Tom Hanks called The Terminal. That movie's about a guy who gets stuck at an airport." So I watched The Terminal movie that night. And it's about a true story of a man who had set up a temporary home in JFK Airport while his papers got processed because he was caught between the United States and his home country when it fell into civil war. And he had to stay in the terminal for months, in fact, I think years. So to survive, he found a dilapidated wing of an airport that was no longer used, and he made himself a temporary home in the abandoned lounge of Gate 67. While many churches are still building the kingdom of God successfully through church-centric models, there are a significant number of people today that are dropping out of Sunday attendance because they are looking for an alternative gathering point. Many people that I've shared this dream story with immediately say to me, "Hey, that's me. I'm living in Gate 67. It's a powerful metaphor. It names a hallway transition movement that some are now experiencing. And when you're waiting in a gate lounge, you have absolutely no intention of staying even one more minute than you need to. It's a temporary shelter for those heading in the same direction. And when your flight is actually delayed, there's usually a communal moan that comes when they announce that because of the temporary nature of where you are. But you still need to eat and drink and communicate and make further plans. And sometimes if the delay is lengthy, you actually even make some friends and start up conversations with those who are also stuck in your gate lounge. Many people who I know and have talked with who have left their Sunday church gathering, who have not left God and still love the church, just want somewhere to find fellowship and spiritual food while they work out the next expression of their faith life in a communal gathering. We need to gather people in these moments of transition and give them a place to belong, to be spiritually fed and to be held in community. And that's why we need chaplains at Gate 67.
Beautiful. Well, I'm joined here today with my friends, and it's a real privilege to get to be curious with you guys around this content that Sue has brought to us. By ways of introduction, we have Rick Lewis. Rick was a local church pastor within Churches of Christ for 30 years and now works as a mentor and consultant to church leaders, both in Australia and internationally. Judy Francis has spent a number of years of her life at Gate 67 herself and is now the Associate Pastor at Campbelltown Church of Christ, where in part in her role she finds herself ministering to others at Gate 67. Sam Haddon has been the senior pastor at Northside in Sydney for 8 years, through COVID and out the other side. And we are privileged to have all three of you join us today for this important conversation. Rick, I'd love to start by asking you, as you watch this video and Sue sharing about this dream that she had, you speak with a whole range of church leaders right across the world. Is this a pattern that you're seeing emerging? And if so, what kinds of emotional reactions are you noticing in church leaders as we see this wave of people move out of churches?
Yeah, in some places, yes. I'd say it's really not very noticeable in places like Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa or South America. But Europe, North America, Australia, yes, it's very much is noticeable. And the emotional reaction, the two big ones I see are hurt and loss of confidence. The hurt is associated with seeing people leaving the church and feeling betrayed, let down, even copping some really unfair criticism. You know, as people give a parting shot as they're walking out the door. The loss of confidence is around, well, I'm doing my best here and it seems to be not enough. So that's a loss of confidence in the trick I've got. You know, I can do this ministry thing. But worse than that, a loss of confidence sometimes I detect in the gospel itself. People feeling like, oh, am I on the losing team here? The church just seems to be getting smaller and smaller. Islam is on the rise. Atheism, agnosticism is on the rise. Like, have I backed the wrong horse?
Wow. And what about for you, when you have got so many years of pastoral ministry? I imagine there would have been people here or there who would have left the churches that you were pastoring. What was it like for you personally when people left?
Look, it's an overused word, but I would say I experienced trauma every time somebody left the church. It was so hard. I really did feel that hurt, because these are friends. These are people that I've prayed for and cared about and visited. So, you know, sometimes I've been through really important moments in their lives with them, and now they're walking out, and all the self-doubt of what did I do wrong? You know, could I have done things better? And all of that, what I noticed now looking back was it stopped me from actually listening to why they were leaving. I was so hurt and defensive and you know, so full of my own emotions. If only I could have gotten over that and properly listened, had some compassion for them, because it wasn't easy for them to leave either. It's not like it was pain-free for them. But looking back, I think I mucked that up. I wish that I'd been able to drop my defences, be less concerned about my own emotional state and truly listen. You know, I was just too invested in what I was trying to build with the church.
Wow. Sam, what about for you? More recently, this has been a really personal journey for you. Could you speak a bit to what that's been like?
Yeah, to carry on from what Rick said, we, like a number of churches, you know, through COVID, there was 30% decrease in our attendances. At the really personal level, I had a whole bunch of close friends in ministry through COVID decide to move to other churches or decide not to come back to church. You know, so there were a whole range of pastors out there that as things were beginning to regather in the church after lockdowns, having to go through that trauma, as Rick was saying, around, hang on, I'm expecting you here this Sunday, and then that Sunday passes, and then they're not there the next Sunday, and then the next Sunday, and the next Sunday. And the sheer awkwardness if you go out for a social dinner together, and do I ask, do I don't ask, do I not, do I... and the emotional energy and the deep grief then that follows when there's a realisation that they're not coming back to the church. And so for me, you know, I still journey with some really close friends who had been elders of the church, involved in each other's weddings, part of the church, as Rick said, who didn't quite know how to say, hey, I want to move on and try something different. And I look back in hindsight at that now and go, that's a wonderful and a good and a God-led thing for them. But at the time, it hurts like hell. And you can't help with your enmeshment into your identity as a minister that a vote to do something different outside your church is a vote against you. What have I done? What have I said? What have I done, Lord, to deserve the pain that I'm feeling in all of this? So that's for those that have at least left the church. Then comes the emotional energy to be alongside those who are still not yet in church, and the deep confusion that happens in a community of people that have done almost every Sunday together for the last 10 plus years, not just as a pastor, but as amongst the peer group. Hang on, what's the deal with that, bud? Why aren't you in church? What are you doing? And to see just at the moment the confusion around how do we deal with someone who's at gate 67?
So it's not just sitting with your own grief, it's sitting with the grief of the community as well.
They should be back. Why aren't they back? Dealing with the judgment that can flow from all of that, and trying to minister into those situations where people just have an expectation, and then as you have congregants that watch in on that, what does it say about you? I had a congregant say to me, well, look at what you're doing to our church. You're wrecking our church, and even your good friend has left. What does that say about your leadership?
Wow.
So there's just a glimpse into some of the practical realities as to what pastors have been through, certainly over the last couple of years. Yeah,
it's real.
Absolutely.
And you've spoken a bit to us around having spent a lot of time sitting with those feelings of betrayal and of grief and processing that on your own and with others in like pastoral groups around what's the why that sits underneath those feelings of grief and betrayal. Can you speak a bit to some of that uncovering work that you've done?
Yeah, I think some of the hardest work is to be forced as a minister through the COVID era of self-differentiating from the church, to come to understand that the church is not my identity, it's my assignment, to use that language. And all that we've been talking about at this conference, I am the beloved Son of God. I'm constantly preaching to my congregation that Christianity is the only religion where you're going to work out what you're going to do when you don't realise you don't have to do anything at all. But I've spent 8 years in senior ministry being driven by the doing. And so behind that, I think at the gut level, amongst Christians, you come to the realisation of the deep idolatry that can happen in ministry around that this is the source of my significance. So every departure, right, part of the trauma is every departure from the church is an assault to my sense of significance before God. I'm not doing the loss of confidence that you were saying, right, Rick, of around, it's not so much just a loss of confidence in my skills as a leader in the church, but my loss of confidence between me and God. Lord, why aren't you blessing me in this? And I've heard colleagues around the room in senior ministry reflect the grief in statements like, when people move on and when we saw the reduction in attendances in the church, say, it's taken me so long to build this. Or words to that effect. It's taken me so long to build this. And sorry?
They're invested in it.
Yeah. And I think at the deep level for us, right, I think it's, what we're really building is the idolatrous nature of ministry, to say what we've really been building is not God's church, because I remember a verse once, it said, like, unless the Lord builds the house, not the pastor, the labourers labour in vain. In fact, this pastor had it on his wall for all of the 8 years of his ministry, and he hadn't learnt that lesson. I think I was having, what I was really building was my own sense of ego, that as the church attendance numbers track up and to the right, then I feel more, more right with God, more of the well done, good and faithful servant, because of what you've been doing in that, not the statement that, as we see in the life of Christ, precedes any of the doing that Jesus does. Don't know why I didn't learn that lesson a little bit earlier in ministry. Yeah.
How do you think that can then impact a pastor's capacity to companion those who have moved out of church attendance, or those at gate 67? If ministry becomes an idol, or if the ego becomes too invested, how does that impact our capacity to come alongside those people?
Well, I think for me, I've come to realise that I feel like a lot of church ministers have a set of concentric circles that represent who's your core I don't know if you guys do this. You've got to have who's your core, and then who are the regulars, and then who are the visitors, and then who are those that we associate with. I think we even kind of structure our church databases to reflect that these days. But we either have these conscious or unconscious concentric circles of who's in. And I think what Gate 67 type people provide us with an opportunity to expand another ring in that concentric circle. And I think the deep question for us is, do we dare to believe that God is sovereignly at work out in this space that Sue's so wonderfully talking about now? And of course, there's nuance around what the ecclesiology around that looks like. And as a church guy, hey, I've got my ideas. And so I don't think it needs to be an either or. I don't think you need to be building brand new wings out there of airport terminals at the expense of conventional church. I don't hear Sue saying that. I certainly don't believe that. But I think a lot of pastors, including myself, have struggled to declare that God is actually active in that space. God is active with that friend of mine who I feel really confused and hurt by because he's not come back to my church. But could it be that God is still at work, and could it be that I've got a part to play in that through the grace that I extend in that? And I think that if we are genuinely for people, then we can be for and present with people at Gate 67, not inside our slidey. We've got slidey doors at Northside, right? So, the snazzy automatic ones. Like that is not the threshold. Our slidey doors are not the threshold of our presence and expression of God's love to a person in their lives. It can be around the dinner table with, by the way, if you've experienced this, the deep emotional burden and energy that it still takes to sit in that space where it's like, hey, this has actually hurt me. This has actually caused me grief. But I love you to an extent that I'm just going to companion you to use that language for this season.
Yeah, and it's tricky, isn't it? Because it does take the grief and the betrayal and the disappointment in itself takes such an emotional toll. And as much as we might say, I can see that Jesus is at work in the Gate 67 nomad space, I think for ministers, there's so much to hold. And we've talked about this earlier, Rick. There's the shifting way that the culture sees the church. There's consumerism and the pressure of that in the church. There's compliance, existential and theological questions around the nature of the church and therefore the nature of the pastor. All the everyday pastoral and leadership needs of a local congregation, as well as the grief and the disappointment and the emotional toll, as you're saying, of sitting in that space. But then alongside that, we might say, well, I want to be where Jesus is and following him and ministering to the nomads as he is there. And Rick, I'd love to hear your thoughts in working in a mentoring space with leaders. How can leaders create the emotional space that's needed to feel compelled to follow Jesus out into those places?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question because it's a question of the heart. And the heart is that's the biggest question. You love the Lord your God with your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. But the heart, our desires, what Jesus said, that's where everything comes from the heart. So, but how do you get at that? If your heart's bent out of shape, how do you get it back where it needs to be? So there are so many things I could say. I'm going to limit myself to 3, okay? The number one, and it sounds like your motherhood and apple pie, but you've just got to stay close to God. You've got to guard the practices that keep you close to the Lord. Walk with Jesus. Guard those practices. And I find in mentoring people, we're talking about scheduling stuff, which sounds terribly prosaic, but it boils down to those habits, those daily habits. Every day, get with the Lord. You've got to get close to him. It'll lean into him. No good will come apart from that it comes from the Lord. So that's number one. Number 2, I'd refer back to what Sam said, your identity, getting enmeshed in your professional role in the institutional church. Well, professional or voluntary, actually. Even volunteer leaders have the same problem. If your identity is enmeshed in your role in the church, you've got a problem right there. Your identity has to be in Christ, not in what you do for him. And the third one, although it sounds terribly academic, but I'd say to get in the right emotional space, you've also got to have your thinking straight, because some of our wonky thinking winds us up in a really bad heart space. So the theology, particularly you sort out your Christology, your missiology and your ecclesiology.
That's a lot of ologies.
I'm sorry for. Well, how do we think about Jesus? And he's got to be number one. Then, how do we think about his mission? And it's really important that mission comes before church, because church has to follow mission, not the other way around. And then we get our thinking about church in the right space. And I don't want to be sort of critical of you, Sam, but I noticed something that you did there when you talked about the concentric circles. There's a trap that us people who lead, well, first of all, we serve Jesus in the context of the institutional church. We think about the work of God, the Missio Dei, through the lens of the church. Big mistake. Do not do this. The kingdom is bigger than the church. When you bring that lens of the church to bear as your starting point, you've started in the wrong place. So don't conceive of the work of God as being essentially about the church. God's church doesn't have a mission. God's mission has a church.
So good. Thank you. And I mean, listening to you guys, I suspect that Jesus is already at work at Gate 67, loving people, ministering to people, and I suspect that he beckons us and invites us to come and join him there and get on board. But I think there are some things that can hold us back, listening to what you guys have been sharing. Judy, I would love to ask you a couple of questions about your ministry, because you not only minister to people who are in this place, but you've been there yourself. And I'd love to ask you about that. You were telling me that during your time at Gate 67, you loved Jesus deeply, but you felt unable to connect with his church at that time. Can you talk to us about what it's like to be in that place and what you needed from the church and from church leaders during that time?
Yeah. Just listening to Sue's video again, that word displaced really just jumped out at me again, because that would have been a big feeling that I had, that I felt displaced and disorientated, because I was in church and serving on all the teams and very involved, and then to be out of the church and not having to go there on Sunday, and just your routine and your rhythm of life has totally turned upside down. So I felt very displaced, very disorientated, very homeless. In fact, and I think vulnerable, and I think alongside that time for me, I was involved in going to a place called LL Ministries, and they do discipleship. So for me, while I was not in a church, I was connecting with a discipleship place every month, and I felt like that tackled a lot of the pain, like a lot of the places where I needed to forgive people, where I needed to repent for my behaviours and my submitting to things. And so, and I think just travelling along that journey, having that discipleship in the background, and then walking through the pain, because that, like, the pain took a long time, and it's still there in the background, because church to me was everything. And maybe Jesus was not everything at that point. Maybe the church was everything, and serving and doing, And so having that stripped away from me, I guess I had that journey of just returning to my first love, and not working for God's approval and not working for his love, but just to know that I am loved without serving at church, which is a huge thing. So I think that, it's been because the pain and the hurt was very deep. The trauma was very deep, so it's taken a long time to just walk through that, and then to re-engage with church and to be back in church, in the position I'm in. It has been a long journey, but my relationship with God has grown deeper, and I think having all that, dealing with the stuff, dealing with my sin, forgiving people, and just allowing Jesus to love me and to accept me the way that I am, for who I am, without a job or a title. I don't know if I answered your question.
Beautifully. Yeah. What do you feel like what would have been helpful from the church during that time? What did you need?
Something Daz said last night that really grabbed me. I don't know how he worded it. I think he was taking Peter Scazzero's line, but he was saying something about listening well to someone is the same as them feeling loved. Was that the line?
That's very Scazzero-like.
Yep. Okay, and I was like, wow, like that's what we need to do. Like we need to listen, we need to hear people, hear their pain, hear their anger, be a safe space for them to be validated. And maybe not everything that they are going through is a right to be validated, but they need to be heard and acknowledged that they're sitting in pain, and that I know, like, I remember one pastor saying to me, oh, well, you need to be in church because otherwise if your coal, like, goes out, like, the fire's going to go out. And you know what? For me, that did not happen. Like, I love Jesus with a passion, and that only grew over the many years of desolation. And but I don't think it's one size fits all. I think there are those people that need to be connected. But for me, it was a different journey that God had me on. But I think listening well to people, holding their pain, hearing their pain, and just loving people where they're at. Not trying to say get back into church and helping them to walk through their pain well. Like helping them if they are offended. We need help. Like offence keeps us out of church. Offence keeps us away from things, and we need someone to walk with us along that journey. And I think I really got that support at LL. Like I remember someone saying to me, like, maybe for this season, church is just you getting a scripture and walking along the beach. And I don't know, is that wrong? Is that church? Being with Jesus, reading His Word, being in creation. Like, is that church? Like for the moment, for a season.
Interestingly for us, and I love that you've reflected the significance, Judy, of the not only the trust that we have with people as God's representative in the church, but I guess like the deep responsibility that we have in terms of crafting a positive experience at the time, right? And I kind of say to our church, like, Christians are like dodgy kebabs. Like, you've only got to have one bad experience with it and you're never going back, And I think it's kind of by God's grace that you're back after having an experience with a few dodgy kebabs.
I think what I get really sad that people, they walk away from the church, but then they walk away from God.
Yes.
And I think that's the thing that, like, well, I don't know if this is right, but I feel like it's okay to walk away from church, but not from God.
Yep.
And He will draw you back. Like, God is doing something in the midst of being in that transit space. Like, He's always moving and always active in someone's life.
Yeah.
And we need to see what's going on for them.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think then? Can it be legitimate for a Christian to spend some time outside of a local church setting? Or is that a broken scenario that we need to fix by getting them back in again?
I think, for me, it's like the presupposition I always had with that mentality of thinking is that, like, I'm somehow solely responsible for a person's spiritual growth and walk with God. That somehow, like, the moment that God, like, causes their path to intersect with mine, it's like He's handed it over as if I'm, like, the master and authority over this person's growth. And, so I think it's that combined with also, I think, like, the posture of the church has been so church-centric. That's where it's sort of come from, that we've, been talking through and wrestling with. You're right, in a sense, Rick. Like, it's been so church-centric. It's like, what techniques, what ministries can we have to bring people into the church, rather than a posture that says, like, how do I serve or be present to that person who is in our midst? So I think the first step for leaders, at least, is to begin to adopt a posture where, like, we are not the sole authority for a person's growth, that when we are involved in that blessed activity with a person, that's just kind of by God's grace that He's invited us into that moment with them. Thank you, Lord. And in so doing, if we have that, then we're able to walk away from that freely. If that person does walk away, there's an inherent belief that, Lord, you've got it, you've got them, I haven't seen them back, but I'm going to trust that you've passed them on to the next place or that you're doing something in that moment. And I think the case study for me has been, I've had lunch with a lady, a colleague of mine in the States. She was part of a mega church in the States of 10,000 people. She was leading entire teams of volunteers in that space. She's not in church at the moment. She's done that for 12 years at a mega. And at best she goes to the local Anglican church down the road, because for her there's something powerful about that form of church at the moment that is transcendent in nature. And so for her, it's just, hey, this is a space, I don't know how long it will represent, but God's doing something in my life. So I think, back to leaders, like if we can have a posture that recognises that we're invited to partner with God in that process for that point in time. If they're not back, that's cool, that's fine. I don't know. Other thoughts, you guys? You've been there.
I really like what Judy said. You were disconnected from inherited model local church, but you weren't disconnected from the people of God. LL was your lifeline. So is it broken when a person is outside of church? Depends on how you define church.
Yeah. Yep.
So if by church you're thinking about that institutional model of a local inherited model church, maybe it's okay for somebody to be outside of that for a while, as you were, Judy. But for a disciple of Jesus to be disconnected from a community of faith, that is broken. But the fix might not be to reel them back into that old model of church that they've left. Maybe there's some fresh imagination around how we can be the people of God in a different form.
And Rick, you've spoken to us about your strong convictions around the importance of discipleship and its centrality to the mission that God invites us into. What do you think that it means for church leaders to faithfully follow Jesus in this time and this context that we find ourselves in? And not only to encourage church leaders to follow Jesus, but to encourage nomads to follow Jesus at the same time.
Well, it's always about following Jesus. I think it's really important to remember, and Sam alluded to this before, that Jesus said he would build his church and he gave us the task of making disciples. And we want to switch it around. We'd love to build the church, and wouldn't it be great if Jesus could make disciples? Because that'd be a whole lot more easy for us. But no, he'll build the church. We need to make disciples. So if we stop making church the lens through which we see everything, and it's the standard by which we judge whether or not we're doing well or not. If we come back to making disciples, someone gets to the edge of a congregation that we're leading and they look like they're leaving, the kind of conversation we have with them must not be about reeling them back into the club. It's got to be about how you're following Jesus now. You're hurt, or maybe you're disappointed, maybe you're bored. Maybe you're really struggling with the demands of a diverse Christian community and you don't know how to deal with that. Well, this is the question. If you're a follower of Jesus, how are you going to be faithful about that now? That might not mean that you come back and join a home group and turn up every Sunday and give you 10% in your offerings, But what is it? Whatever it is, be faithful in following Jesus. The trouble is, as people who've got a role within the institutional church, not only our own thinking about that, but a lot of our peers, it doesn't allow for that kind of freedom and permission giving. It's we got to reel them back in, and I think that's self-defeating. We're putting the cart before the horse. And I reckon if we actually dealt with people a little bit more generously and gave freedom and encouraged them to follow Jesus, look, maybe they wouldn't be back in church, but we'd have good relationships, and we might find that there could be an ongoing, can you imagine, Sam, out of Northside, there being a relationship with another kind of community of faith. You don't own it, you don't run it or control it, but there's good relationship, and what a beautiful thing that could be to allow different kinds of being the people of God together, faithful to Jesus, but just, on parallel courses, don't go in the same direction.
Judy, I'd love to ask you what your sense is as to what Jesus might be inviting church leaders into in the midst of all of this.
That's a big question. I think I think what I've already said about holding space for people, really, and allowing them to just be.
Yeah, there's a lot of freedom in that, isn't there?
Permission to be where they're at.
Yeah.
And allowing Jesus to be their Lord, not the pastor or the church.
Which is difficult to do. Sweeping back to what we talked about at the beginning, when there's ego and idolatry and all these things going on. And grief that we can get stuck in. It's difficult to provide that freedom to simply hold space and follow Jesus as he ministers to them. As we start to bring this to a close, I'd love to ask, is there a final word or encouragement that you would each like to bring to our listeners, to the group here today? What would you like to say, a final word of hope or encouragement?
I want to encourage us to listen to the voice of Jesus as he seeks to radicalise us. I think what he's saying is, it's a bit like our forefathers in Church of the Christ. He wants to strip away the accretions of human traditions, get us back to the basics. We talk about, Islamic radicalisation. Well, how about some Christian radicalisation? And I think some of the people at Gate 67 just could be really key conversation partners in a new imagination of what it means to be a Christian radical. And we do need to faithfully and wisely and responsibly steward the structures that we've inherited and the assets that we've inherited. But that faithfulness does not mean preserving what has been in the past. It might mean leveraging those things for something which has never been before, but God's revealing in our time.
Wow.
Yeah, I would say that I'm excited about the creative opportunity that it's bringing us as leaders as we look to reach people that are in a different space. And, for me as a practitioner, I would say in hearing what Rick said too, it's absolutely possible to both end this. If there are people who have got to run the church and, as Rick said, steward the assets and the rest, it's totally possible to both end it because they're the sorts of things that we're seeking to do at the moment. At the moment, I'm discipling a guy out of Texas who discovered us online, who clicked the link through to my diary as part of a Sunday service. It's just an experiment. I'm not saying that it's, the be-all and end-all, but these are just the fun, creative ways that we're seeking to be both, a church that, as we say at Northside, multi-site and multi-expression. I think there's an opportunity to both end this and to be creative about it. But most of all, there are the people like the Judys that are coming back that have been hurt and burnt by church. There are people coming back saying, I'm just going to give it one more go. I've heard more stories in the last 3 years of very similar to yours, Judy. I was almost done with the church, but I've been pursuing God in this, and I'm going to give it a go. So God's at work. I think it's going to come down to, as we're saying, our own reflections around how much of the inner work we're prepared to do, to be willing to hold these structures and the way of doing things lightly and to steward them well and creatively.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
I don't know if my words are as wise as these two guys, but I guess I just feel like Jesus will never let us go. He'll never let his kids go. And can we trust that? Like as leaders and as people at Gate 67, can we trust that he'll never let us go?
That's beautiful. Thank you. I wonder, listening to this conversation, whether a new thing that Jesus might be doing might actually grow up out of the soil of ministry to nomads. If we could have the courage to do the work, to lay down our egos, to process our grief that can so easily keep us stuck, and to develop curiosity and compassion and that emotional space for Jesus to compel us forward, to join him in the thing that he is doing in this space. I wonder what he might do. We're going to have a follow-up podcast for this, a part 2 in the new year, talking some more about this and getting more into what might this look like, what are some next steps, what are more of the hows of this conversation. So if this has been of interest to you, please join us in the new year when we have another conversation around this. But for today, Rick, thank you. Judy, thank you. Sam, thank you. And to our audience, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope this has been a blessing to you. I trust that the Holy Spirit has been at work within you, speaking to you, giving you what you need. If this has opened something up for you, if it's stirred something within you, we are all available to talk and to pray. If that is something that would be helpful for you, please don't hesitate. Come forward, talk to us. That's it for today from us. Please enjoy the rest of your afternoon and see ya.